Welcome everyone again to 123 Chess. And man, I think this is what, our ninth episode, Tom?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, it's so crazy. It's already gone so quickly. And I don't know about you, but I've felt like I've learned so much already, like in all kinds of areas. I mean, we've now memorized what, 4 Grandmaster games, and we've gone through, all these different games with both reviewing, analyzing, discussing. And then last week, if you guys didn't catch it, we had a live guest with us, Olivier, who gave us some really helpful insight as well. Some of which I know probably we're both taking into this conversation. But yeah, it's been super exciting. So I'm really glad you guys have joined us again. And if you're a class level player, or anyone else who's a sub tournament level or recreational, please join us, because this is going to really help you guys to have kind of a consistent and just really solid structure to improving your chess game in all the different ways. So without any further ado, I will go ahead and jump in here. What we're doing this time is we're analyzing our game 4. And so we each chose our moves to analyze, and then we'll be playing for you guys the Grandmaster game we memorized. And so here we go. So, okay. This game started out with the London. So I did a queen pawn opening, pretty straightforward. We call this the accelerated London, because I'm not going to give any ambiguity. I'm just going to go for it and make it known what I'm going to play. Kind of like a mirror setup here. All right. And then at this point, okay, we get the development just about done. Here's the first attempt to kind of contest the center. Bring the bishop back. So far, nothing yet that I want to go in depth with, but we'll get to it in a moment here. Okay, so I decided that I was going to go for controlling this e5 and inadvertently also the f6 in this particular game. That was kind of my thought process. Okay, developing the queen to start the attack. Okay. So we got some counterplay over here. And then also now I'm threatening to kick his knight so that I can go for this mating threat that I have here with my queen and bishop. All right, so that was a long time. I'm all the way at move 14 for my first move to analyze. I just chose 2 this week, but very insightful, because one of the things, if you guys have done anything in the way of, like, you've learned an opening well and you've gotten to the mid game, and then you get to the part where you have a clear advantage, but the question is, how do you end it? And that is a little bit of the challenge for what I'm going to be discussing, because this is the point when what did I do next? I pushed the pawn. Now, this makes logical sense from the standpoint that I want to make contact with one of his kingside pawns. So one of his defenders of the king, that was my simple goal. It also, what it did is it opened up the file. If I went for this, if either he took it or I took it, it would start opening up that file. And then I could move my king over, maybe plop a rook there, or my queen, either way. So that's what I did in the game. But what I want to do here is kind of take a step back and look at another option, because one of the things when you have this clear, so, keep in mind, all of these pawns are locked up. So we really have a very clear and differentiated pawn structure that is going to allow me to have a little bit more leisure to launch my attack without too much response from the opponent. So what I went through is I was thinking about other options, aggressive and positional, and I decided that, and I did check this against the chess engine too, but one of the moves that I wanted to look at is, what if I did this? So pretty simple. Instead of pushing the pawn, I'm going to take the aggressive sacrifice of my bishop. And of course, there's multiple options that Tom could have done here. And well, the obvious one, let's look at that first. The obvious one would be just taking it. So now, obviously, after he takes it, if I take with my queen, well, let's look at the material first. I just lost my bishop, so that bishop was sacrificed in order to take out 2 pawns. So I'm 1 point behind in that sense. Positionally speaking, what we have here is if this knight moves, the threat is still checkmate right here on this square with my queen and bishop. And then I also have this pawn that's still here and ready to kick that knight. Additionally, there's only 1 pawn defending the king, and so at this point, this is the fire square where I'm going to try to get some action. So I mean, there's a lot of options here. I can push this pawn up, and you know, I can move the king. All the stuff I mentioned before are still options for me. And as long as I keep it solid, I can still maintain the lock of these pawns so that this guy can't get out. These guys still are pretty sad over there in the corner. The queen really can't really get anywhere. So this is a very clear advantage. And there's no grandmaster would look at this position and say, oh, you know, that was a dumb sacrifice. Why did you get rid of that bishop? I mean, there's nothing here that says anything other than it will at least equalize my material if we go into the end game, but I'll have a better position. And at best, I'll get a checkmate earlier on. So with that in mind, let's look at, so this is just one example. The chess engine decided that the rook move was probably the best option because that would allow probably, you know, moving the bishop out there, and there's another square open near the king. So then I'd probably do something like this. And after the bishop moves there, well, there we go. Now look at the material. After I take this, then I'm 2 points ahead. I've now gained the minor piece back, and these pawns are all still locked up. There's no activated pieces for these 3. I can move my king here. The rook's got a clear file. I mean, what person what person could look at this and not say this is a very clear? So I think in conclusion with this particular example or move, going back to here, what I did was fine and it was logical. It was the computer called it a blunder, but in all practical purposes, it wasn't bad. But the problem is it made it complicated. And as we see, just to give you a brief look at, you know, going forward a little bit, at this point, it started to get a little complex. You know, I mean, I had to be really careful, and there were, you know, some pieces hanging, some sacrifice options. The point is, it was a lot harder to maintain that advantage. And if I made a blunder, Tom could have taken it and pulled the rug out from under me on the attack. So what the bishop sacrifice would have done for me is it would have done one simple thing. It would have simplified the game. And that simplification is exactly what would have made it, you know, both of us, if we had played the, you know, the full like best move after this point, Tom could have kind of, you know, he could have made it drawn out a lot more and possibly even, you know, even gained the upper hand if I did some mistakes. Do you want to say anything on that idea,
Oh,
Tom?
I think that's fair. One of the moves that I was looking at in some of my lines though was instead of the recapture once that pawn is taken, and it
Mm-hmm.
from this exact position, it was from a different position, but same
Right.
sort of thing. That same pawn, same bishop,
Mm-hmm.
and the move in response was to move the pawn forward and let the capture of the rook happen.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, that's interesting because that was the second part here. So this, and you know, honestly, this is probably what I would have done too. I mean, yeah, you lose the rook potentially, but ironically enough, after I looked at this more in depth, because we all want to take this. I mean, who doesn't want to take that? But there's actually perhaps a better line that's an option for me, and it goes something like this. So if I push this pawn up here to f4, and then, I mean, we'll just, from here, excuse me, from here, there's probably a lot of options that, you know, that you could have done, Tom. Like, I don't know maybe this is kind of one I selected as a viable option. It seems pretty logical. You could have retreated this back here. The computer said that something like this would have been a little bit better, perhaps. So anyway, so then if okay, I'm moving it up again, and this is just one continuation option. So you take that, and after, when all the trades are done, you kind of get something like this, in which after, it's kind of a forced trade. There's another option too, a few other lines I looked at, which is a similar dynamic, but you end up like this, basically. So again, this is just one.
That actually seems like a far better position than the previous one that we went over.
Yeah, exactly. So and the amount of difference from taking the pawn, or sorry, taking my bishop versus advancing it was very minimal in what I saw, if I remember correctly. So either way, it really does end up with a clear advantage. And I think in both cases, again, it simplifies the position for me. I think that's kind of the theme of what I was noticing in that. So honestly, that was the biggest move I analyzed, but I do want to look at one more real quickly. But just to conclude that, after we get back to this point, next time I enter a position like this where I have some mating threats going for me, I have a clear advantage, and everything's locked up, I think what I need to remember is, what is the easiest way to simplify it down so that I can get a clear win as swiftly as possible. And it doesn't mean that it's funny because I thought, oh yeah, it's definitely a checkmate. But then, I actually played against a computer at this point, and I tried both lines, and it went on and on and on. I'm like, okay, yeah, this is grandmaster level. Cause I mean, it's weird. Like, no matter what I did, it went kind of into an end game, and I still had an advantage, but it wasn't like it ended for us because, we can't see grandmaster moves every time. But yeah. So anyway, that was my first one. Then we kind of went along like this, and some very, very interesting maneuvers by both of us. And then we get to this point. So we mentioned last week that the rook move was kind of a desperado sort of thing that, probably, honestly, I probably would have done something like that too, given the position. But ironically enough, so what I did was I went for this force. But the irony of this is I just had to look a little bit further, because yeah, it's kind of dumb not to take it, I guess, but technically, if you went there, then it wasn't really checkmate yet, because then I mean, I have a few different things. I could go here and take this. I could also move my queen. So it's one of those things where I slightly overlooked my options, and if I just went something like this, then, well, what are the options? Well, there's one, and then there's checkmate. So it just goes to show you that isn't it Ben Feingold that said, if you see a good move, keep looking, there's one better? I don't know, it's probably just a common phrase, but that's really true. And I think one of the easiest mistakes to make, especially when this kind of position was, I had an overwhelming space advantage, I've locked it up, everything I had going for me, but it's important to really calculate what are the best ways to continue it, and not just make careless things. I think one thing I learned, and I think this is the last thing I'll say for mine, Tom, but one thing I learned in this game a lot, and this isn't one of my big takeaways, but it's just something that I think demonstrates that I've improved since our game one. The whole game, I was very, very cognizant of not unlocking these pieces. And so this was the old me would have definitely taken that bishop, right? It was tempting, and I like the bishop pair, and there's all these types of things, but case in point, I did everything I could to make absolutely sure that I wasn't unlocking your pieces on the queen side. And I think I would go so far as to say, if I did take the bishop, earlier on, I think it would have been a super, super close and longer game. I don't know.
I feel like honestly, I feel like part of my rationale for moving it there was like, man, I hope he takes this bishop, and
Yeah.
the you didn't like just left me behind.
Yeah, so I think that's something that I usually when we talk on these things, I usually say how many things I need to improve on, but I need to remember there are certain things I have improved on, and this is definitely one of them. To be extra careful to calculate hey, that was a takeaway last game 3, wasn't it? When I was saying how, be careful, what will it look like when you take a piece? What will the position be after that? And that should dictate whether it's wise to or not. So simple, but something that I need to remember. So yeah, it was really just those 2 moves, Tom, that I went through. I think that was the most invaluable for me to go through. So
Cool.
I'll pass the torch to you now.
Great. Well, this is my analysis, and yeah, this was a big learning experience for me. I was really excited to do this because I really have very little familiarity with the London system. So just being able to break it apart was nice. Um, I did feel like I navigated the opening pretty well, which has come from, um, I had no familiarity really with it, but just my knowledge, my limited knowledge of opening theory kind of helped guide me here. Um, I did debate between this one and the D6 square. And actually that was not one that I chose to explore. But I do think the D6 square would have been a really interesting one because a lot of the lines that I'm seeing in the London system tend to be attacking that dark squared bishop.
Mm-hmm.
Because it helps disrupt White's strategy. And you notice too, because that pawn has moved up, the dark squared bishop that's there on f4, it doesn't have a lot of places to go at this point, which is why I think that you see it being attacked a lot. But, I didn't do that. But this was another move that I did explore here. So instead of saying, okay, what if I brought my bishop here? I said, okay, let's forget about that bishop altogether. I was operating under this kind of idea, right? And you saw it later in our game as it actually progressed, which I'll show you real quick just to remind you. I do push that that c pawn forward. Which is actually kind of a reoccurring thing that I saw in a lot of the defenses against the London system, is that c pawn coming forward to c5. But in this example, it was done earlier, which I really like because I messed around with that bishop beforehand. If you had the situation where, let's say, White captures, well, now you get to take with the bishop. You didn't waste a move on it. You get that development, and that's awesome. Now, that's a bad move for White. White should not be, capturing that pawn there. But either way, I think part of my reason for moving the bishop when I did is sort of the notion that I had. I don't know. I think it was our first game that we analyzed, Luke, and it was me tripping my knight, being resistant to moving my knight in front of my queen. I think is what it was, before my bishop, right?
Yes, it was in. Yep, that's exactly what it was.
Yep, and it was the same sort of thing where it was like, I really want to prepare the castle, so I want to get my bishop out of the way first, and that was not something that I really needed to focus that much on. I've got time. The attack isn't like hammering me so hard that I don't have time to castle. So bringing my pawn out, gaining some space in the center is a legitimate option. I basically just did the moves that Luke did in response because, example of the London system or, classic London system is White's not too concerned with how black is playing. So this was, again, the other thing that I looked at. I really do like bringing the queen out, and that's kind of why I saw that there to this b6 square.
I like that move.
Yeah, which also seems to be kind of a common theme, again, with a lot of the defenses against the London system, is getting the queen on this square. And you will later see that, honestly, that so the three moves that I really noticed as a common theme were queen on b6. I noticed the light squared bishop moving to b7. And we'll get there, but this knight moving over here to h5.
Yep.
So those are kind of common themes in the defenses that we will see. And I should also specify that the defense that I am doing right now. So this is one of the common defenses. Another one that I did see highly recommended too was more of a modern defense. Where you get this pawn moving out, and then you fianchetto the bishop on b7 queen side. I don't know if anybody's gathered this about me yet, but I feel very uncomfortable with modern defenses in general. I feel very uncomfortable with fianchettoing my bishops. I try to avoid that. Because I'm just not comfortable with the lines that they generate. This is much more within my comfort zone.
Which is funny because you used to, a long time ago in high school, I remember you used to do the kingside fianchetto quite a bit.
Yeah, I did. So yeah, I like this move, moving the queen out. Explored that, and this was just a recommended move by the engine. Obviously, this pawn being threatened. It could move forward if it is. The biggest thing that I think we're seeing here is the moves that I'm doing as black here are disrupting the momentum that white has and forcing white to respond to my attack.
Yep.
Which me being the player that I am, I really like that as the aggressor. Same sort of thing, moving that knight out. It's putting that additional pressure on this pawn, forcing again another response.
Yeah.
And then concluding with that that knight, which now looks really good because that knight is now threatening to capture that bishop.
Yep. And
at this point, the bishop can move here or here. I mean, I suppose the bishop could move here, but wow, that's that's a pretty forward bishop. And we're just setting myself up later in the game for being able to push that pawn forward once I've castled. I think that this ends up generating a lot of positive things for black. I mean, obviously this is not like game winning here, right? I just think it's much better counterplay because if he doesn't move that bishop there, very likely my next move is going to be to capture his bishop, be it with this knight if he moves here, or this knight if he moves to one of the to that square, or if he stays there, right?
Yeah.
So that was the first kind of sequence that I looked at. But by no means was me moving my bishop here a bad play. Game certainly not over. The early castle wasn't bad. And then I move this one out, the pawn out, which was a move that I talked about. Was a good move. And, we get that counterplay, white having to respond, which is fine. And even this move, we did discuss when Olivier was here that, you know, it would have been nice for me to have developed my minor pieces a little bit more at this point in time in the game. But the engine really actually didn't have a problem with me pushing that pawn forward, which I think makes sense because there's still time here for me to develop those minor pieces. Now, what ends up happening, right, is I end up going to pushing another pawn forward and pushing another pawn forward. And now at this point in time, like those were moves where those probably I should have been getting something else engaged instead of pushing those pawns consistently. So from there, I looked at this is a different one. So not pushing them pawn forward again. That the engine didn't mind that so much. But I did look at here what would have happened had I done that knight move at this point. And it is that same sort of thing. You know, I'm giving the option of retreating to that square, which is no longer threatened on this one. But let's say he moves there. Now I bring my knight out, and now it is being threatened. Which then again goes to the development of those minor pieces. It goes to attacking that dark squared bishop. All around, I think that would be a much more solid gameplay.
Yeah.
Again, this is the one that I was starting to hit on. So bringing these out here, and I think it was this move that I looked at. Yeah. So in the game, what ends up happening is I bring my A pawn forward. And I, admittedly, I don't feel like I had a really solid game plan in why I was bringing that A pawn forward. I said in my notes here, I feel like I'm set up for a queenside pawn storm. And being set up for a queenside pawn storm, I was like, well, storming with pawns, just bring them all in. And when I looked at this again, you know, even if I'm talking about doing a queenside pawn storm, right? That's the move that I'm really wanting to do. But I already have my bishop there. That's our intended move.
Exactly.
I don't need to bring that A pawn forward to get it into the mix. And so I said, okay, well, what if I just did it? Right? What if I didn't waste time with the A move and I just brought that forward? Again, going with Luke's moves that he actually did.
This is interesting.
Yeah, this one blew my mind, and I needed to look into this one for why the heck bring that bishop there actually, because you know, I think I would have intuitively brought maybe the knight out there to challenge.
That's a strong bishop now, almost, as long as it can be broken, like the pawn chain.
Yes, that pawn chain is the thing. But it is in a good spot. And again, that seems to be a common placement in the London system for that dark squared bishop, getting him on that B7 square. And so I've got a line here just showing why that's the case. Okay, so this again, I'm using Luke's moves as he actually played, right? That queen, sure, it's in the line of the bishop, but there's a pawn there blocking it, and he's not intending on keeping it there, so that's not that big of a deal. Again, we're now getting into the development of my minor pieces, which was a problem that I had run into in the first place. And you'll notice, actually, one of the things that bishop actually allows is for that knight to move there now, right?
Ah, yeah.
Yeah, because before, the only place for my knight to move was this square in front of the queen. So that's interesting. Again, doing Luke's moves here. This was an interesting one that the engine had recommended, was bringing that pawn forward, because later on, I mean, obviously I ended up bringing up that pawn for defense purposes, same exact pawn. And this is recommending at this point in time, whereas a mistake when I did it. But
yeah,
I mean,
and can I, sorry,
yeah,
can
go
I
ahead.
mention something too? I'm just interested, you might be getting to this here shortly, but now if I go for that bishop sacrifice on the pawn, now what happens is if you take my knight and then I take your knight with my pawn, sure, your knight has to move out of the way, but now your bishop will be unlocked within a
Well,
couple
and
moves.
so that was one of the lines that I explored. I'm gonna show it to you now. So if you had captured there at this point, which was always this move that was really threatening to me, right? I examined recapture here with that G pawn, which is take. Now get that knight out of the way, which turns into a capture. My knight has to move, obviously. Now I unlock this line. I block this bishop.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It's pretty wild. And I mean, looking at this position, I will say this made me feel uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, it makes me feel uncomfortable too, though.
That queen is, it's so close to my king, but there's no pieces really backing it up very well right now. It's kind of just by itself. And
what if F3 though?
From here, F3?
Yeah.
You're gonna make me think here.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. I think maybe from here, without any degree of certainty, not having looked into it too much, it might be bringing my bishop out and actually attacking the queen.
Oh yeah, I didn't even see that. Yeah, that's much better. Yep.
Then I get the queen moving. Now I've got another piece over on that side to help with the defense of the king. Right now, that knight and that pawn are both hanging. So bishop on that square.
Yeah.
Attacking all three of those pieces at the same time.
Man, that's amazing. That battery with, again, those batteries with the queen and bishop are so powerful.
Yeah. But it was. I certainly would not have loved playing this position because just how open my king is. But it would have been interesting, and the chess engine has it pretty darn close here. Now the other line that I ended up looking at, going from this point, was actually that that F3 move, and then a capture. F3 move was actually the recommended chess engine move. I thought it seemed a little bit more passive than this here. I thought that was kind of like a more obvious play. But I wanted to explore that line that the computer had said was recommended. So we get the capture, and then actually in this variation, the computer recommends the knight retreating. And I thought this was interesting because from my perspective, this it's funny. I don't know. I mean, it seemed it like seems a little bit safer from here, but the problem is we run into the exact same thing that we had in the last one, right? Because that capture there is always an option. That being said, I do think that this was the part where I had really explored, though I'm not sure. I don't have it written down on my notes where I had seen that as the viable option here. And with the knight cleared out of the center here, it gives me a little bit more room to maneuver my pieces, I think.
Yeah, like with this position, I would have felt a lot more, I just would have kind of felt a little outside of what I was going for. So I probably would have just not thought much and taken your rook because I wouldn't have seen what else I could do to kind of launch an attack.
Yeah, and I mean, because you sacrificed that bishop, it gets it. I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, I'm certainly down in material a little bit, but the main attack has been pretty well neutralized. And now that pawn structure,
Mm-hmm.
as Luke was pointing out in his analysis, was kind of a weakness for me, suddenly becomes a strength, because now it's really bogging down some of the squares that Luke would like to occupy. And now that gives me the option to really focus. I've repelled the attack on the king side pretty well at this point, and now I can probably get into focusing a little bit more on my queen side attack.
Yeah. I think the only thing I have going for me right here is that I still have my e5 pawn.
Yeah. Yep. So that was another one that I had looked at. Now,
man, you did some in depth with this.
I really liked the game. Again, it was a huge learning opportunity for me. So this is the way that our game played out. And this was, I was going to say the last one. Nope, almost the last one. I looked at this one too, because this is actually identified as a blunder by the engine. And so instead, what engine wants to recommend is that pawn move now. Which actually, like, that was the first one that I had considered. That was the first move that I had considered, was that G6. But much like my last game, and this was a takeaway that I had said, was and I think that this kind of works out for me sometimes. I have a tendency to go at ooh, this looks weird and creative, I'm gonna try it. And sometimes I think it surprises my opponents, it takes them off guard, and it can give me a little bit of an edge. And other times it blows up in my face. It looks weird because it's weird. And I think this was one of those situations. Moving that pawn forward looked weird, and it looked weird because I shouldn't have done it. This was a little bit more solid. So just going through, you know, one of the possibilities here of what could have happened. And I really looked at this move. I looked at a couple of them here. I looked at moving this pawn forward, right, pushing the pawn.
Yep.
Pushing the bishop, pushing the pawn, or being much more conservative and just doing something like that. And I don't know, Luke, out of those moves, are any of them stand out to you as like, yeah, you know, that's the move I would have done?
I probably would have moved the bishop, just because I have the backward f2 pawn. And so my whole idea from this point would probably be to, kind of similarly to what happened in the game, is to unlock my f rook, so I can take that file. But I think one thing that's interesting about your moving the g6 pawn, or pawn to g6 instead of h6, is I think, and it's funny because I didn't even think about this till now, but what it does is it basically renders my g pawn unable to make contact with any of your pawns.
Yeah.
It's a very simple idea, but that one element alone, now that if I want to use my pawns to unlock it, I have to actually unlock your white bishop.
Yeah.
And that's scary.
It was really, I mean, honestly, so that move kind of made me say, like, oh man, that would have crushed it would crush your hopes and dreams with moving that pawn forward, and then all of a sudden that pawn move looks a little silly now.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
But yeah, if we get the that move forward, this was the one that was actually recommended, which I thought was interesting, and I saw this a few times again as leaving that rook susceptible to the bishop attack.
And at this point, I think I probably would have brought my my other knight into the game. Yeah,
so like bringing it to f3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I believe here the recommended line, I think. Oh, well, that's interesting because it replaces that knight if I take that there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be my whole reasoning behind it.
I'm guessing because you're bringing that knight there, that's probably a viable move at this point.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, just not spawn. Being able to bring that bishop in again.
Yeah.
Square bishop, and just giving myself a little bit more room with my king. Yeah. Once again, I think this is just a much more defendable position now. The computer certainly at this point in time did say the advantage was to white. But I think this was one of my last real moments to really fight for some real counterplay and be able to get to the end game with a fighting chance.
Yeah, I think you could have equalized the position like this pretty well.
Yeah. Obviously, what ended up happening was all of this. And then this was the last move that I took a look at. And really here, and I think I did say this in our last video, is it's pretty much lost at this point in time. Black is in a pretty losing position. But I wanted to look at this move just because this move in particular, it did hang that pawn, which is a nasty habit I've got to get out of doing, is hanging pieces.
Me too.
Yeah, so I looked at this move here, bringing the bishop down, which is actually a pretty solid position now because it just gives me more defense on the side of the king. Engine recommended capturing there. Not sure if Luke would have done that, but again, just exploring this line here.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's where it ended up going.
Wow.
Yeah. So this was all just engine generated moves, right?
Yeah. That's brilliant, though. I wouldn't have thought of that.
Yeah. And then these get captured, and you see, I mean, once again, like this is certainly a rough position for Black, but certainly better off than the defense side did. But yeah, that was just what could I have done without hanging a piece, and that was what it was. So
nice.
Yeah, Luke, if you want to go ahead and give your key takeaways.
Yeah. So just 3 simple key takeaways for me. The first one, let me back up to here. Okay, so the first key takeaway for me is in the London system, there's essentially 3 primary elements, overarching elements to just be aware of as far as strategy goes. Number 1 is kingside attack is usually the name of the game for what most London players intend to. However, that's not always the case, and so that's why I want to bring up right here. After we get to this point, there is the other option. Now, the danger here is Tom can still bring his bishop out here, but aside from the fact of, like after I castle and stuff, let's say if I castle a little bit before, the other idea with the London is you have the option of when you break through the middle, and making that pawn break in the middle and opening it up can be a very timely strategy as well. And it's interesting because the Grandmaster game that we memorized is they went for that pawn break and ended up with the advantage in the end. But
and I do think that's one of the big reasons why you see Black's bishop move to that B7 square quite frequently in the defense.
Yes, I agree. Because that's a weak point for Black usually in this. So I think, so number 1, kingside attack is usually what you're going for. You usually try to lock up all these pawns here. That's certainly what I did. But then also sometimes I've seen it where higher level players, they'll be going for one strategy and they'll switch it up based on their opponent's responses. So maybe they're going for a pawn break in the middle to go for some queenside attack, and they switch it up to a kingside threat, or vice versa. This is a common thing in the London system. The third thing I'll mention is that in the London, like Tom mentioned, you usually see queenside counterplay like this. So you usually see the rook coming out here and going for that. And the thing Tom mentioned earlier with the queen coming here like way earlier in the game, attacking that weak pawn there, that's a very, very common thing too. So the London system's whole goal is to make the game play how you want it to, not worrying about what your opponent's doing. And as long as you're aware of the threats coming from the queenside attack and trying to unlock the light square bishop, it's usually pretty solid and can come with some interesting endgame scenarios. My number 2 takeaway was exploiting weaknesses properly. So this goes back to, you know, when I mentioned finally once I had launched the kingside attack and we got to this point that was my main move I chose to analyze. The thing I need to remember in the future is that when I have see, I had my plans, but then Tom moved something that I wasn't expecting, and so the idea is, just because you have plans doesn't mean you should execute those plans not switching them or tailoring them to what your opponent just did. So this pawn here should have caused me to consider taking it, but I already had this intention, right? So I was doing what I already planned to do, but I was kind of tunnel vision, if that makes sense, because I wasn't really reacting to what Tom was doing and changing it up to make it better when something better was waiting for me. And then my last takeaway is watching for counterplay threats. It didn't escalate too far in this game for me, so I kind of lucked out, but I do need to always watch for the queen side counterplay. So just real quickly, what I mean by that is at this point, you know, once we get to where he started pushing the pawns, and right here, now Tom mentioned about how, I know you mentioned this last week about the queen coming here.
Yep.
So we have things like this that now it's a little late in the game for his queen to pop there, but right here, now the idea is, you know, let's just move a dumb move, and then now we go for the pawn break. Okay, well now we have a real weakness, and then, you know, so the point is, I just have to make sure to be careful as I'm launching my kingside attack to not, especially in this kind of opening, to not allow the queenside attack to become a big enough threat to totally subvert my intentions. So yeah, so those are my 3.
Cool. I would say my big takeaways. I'm going to steal a lot out of Luke's book here and go with a positional takeaway, right? In the London system, this night, and it's a similar takeaway to, I know that we've mentioned it in a past video, but putting it on the edge, and a night on the rim is dim. The adage, and the typical play, you don't want to put that knight out on the edge of the board. But there are many lines where taking that knight and putting it on the edge of the board like that, especially, I think where I mostly see it, where I've seen it a lot now in gameplay, is when it's attacking a bishop. Very active bishop.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest reasons, I think.
Yep. And you know, and I think the reason for that is because you've got a bishop that's active, it's in the middle of the board there, and when your knight moves up on its second move to the edge of the board, it's attacking those 2 squares. And those are the pivotal squares for the bishop. I did see that sometimes that pawn will be moving out, which just gives the light squared bishop or the dark squared bishop a spot to retreat on. But I think that's still relatively uncommon. The games that I saw, while I saw in a chat like that sometimes happens, I didn't see it in any of the games that I was looking at specifically. So yeah, so moving that knight, focusing on that knight, letting it go to the edge, with the intention of disrupting White's plan. And that comes in the form of taking out that squared bishop. So that was one, kind of focusing on that. Again, that positional aspect of looking for an opportunity to move my my bishop to this square, which we talked about, defends quite well from this pawn push forward. It also allows some nice counterplay for if that knight moves up. Oops, it's a nice defensive square, getting my knight out onto c6. But not only that, you know, if that whole pawn structure gets broken up, just having my light squared bishop on the that b7 square, I've got the major diagonal covered very well, which can end up turning into a good attack against the king down the road.
Yeah.
So again, another positional thing. Bringing that pawn forward, which I did do in my gameplay. This is one of the biggest things that I like patted myself on the back for, was recognizing that as a solid gameplay. That is one of the things that I've seen is quite common in playing against the London system. And again, bringing back the queen out to b6, with really the intention, I'm going to say takeaway number 3, though I like these have just kind of been jumbled together, is strong plays on the queen side. If I'm going to be launching an attack against the London system, his development is fast, and so mine needs to be fast as well.
Yeah.
I can't allow a slow attack that he can just ignore, because the attack needs to be strong enough and fast enough when I'm playing as black against the London to force my opponent to respond to my gameplay, which is very much in line. I love that, because I love me some tempo.
Yep. And I think oh, sorry, did you have
I was
more?
just going to say those were my takeaways. Go ahead.
The only last one thing, and this is a bonus for any of you guys watching, you know, in the future when we get more viewers. No, but no, honestly, like if any of you guys have never played the London system, as exemplified by this instance when it was new for both of us, and if you are like me and you have the problem with not knowing where to put your bishops, especially your dark square bishop for white usually ends up being the last minor piece developed and sometimes never finding a good home, this is a perfect system for that. It's outside of your pawn chain, and your light square bishop has a perfect spot too. I mean, it's a really simple opening, but it's played at the grandmaster level. It's not one of these little pet openings for lower rated players. It's actually a legitimate system, and it's hard to break. It's hard to crack. So I would recommend trying it.
And I think I might going forward. I thought that it was really interesting. I enjoyed learning about it.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess to finish things up, would you like to go through our Grandmaster game we memorized?
Yeah, sounds great.
And just for the sake of time, I'll just put the description of who played it and all of that, as well as the PGN in the description below. Alrighty, so let's get into this game. Accelerated London system. So same as ours so far.
And this one's interesting because it kind of the C pawn. It was a common theme in a lot of them, a lot of the analyses I saw to bring that C pawn out fast, and they brought it out even faster than I did in my analysis.
Yeah. Okay, and then we already have the knight developed. Okay, and
pushing just like I did.
Yep. Okay, and then I'm going to go for a castle.
Castle in response.
And now prepare for in case he advances to b4.
And then again, that bishop move that I said was very common in the system.
Yep. Now the interesting thing, this is where it really deviates from our game, is now white is threatening to open the middle.
And black responds similarly to what I did, which was just ignoring it and
and now it was a double threat because now the knight has been kicked from its post going back. So that doesn't exactly look particularly awesome. And now the rook is gonna threaten if black plays f6 and then the pawn takes, well then the rook's got a free pawn. Okay.
That continues the pawn storm.
This is a move I definitely would have not moved my queen there like that. That was interesting. I mean, I know it threatens over here, but still.
And that's what black does, is it saves its pawn.
Okay, and now a knight maneuver.
Yeah, knight maneuver, knight maneuver. And then this right here is actually recognized as a blunder by the engine.
Yeah, I was gonna say even though I didn't know that, I don't like it. It doesn't really accomplish much.
And I think seeing the attack here is why this move takes place, just wanting to bring that knight in for defense.
Yeah, exactly. And now the attack has begun. Queen's brought into the action. Wanting to open up that G file. Now the pin has begun. And from here on out, well, this is where they ended it. So yeah, so that's where it ended. It was a 22. That was even less moves than our game, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
It was like 3 moves less. So that just goes to show you that I again, for me, I found it particularly interesting when white advanced the pawn here and then again to here. That was a key pivotal moment, I think, for me, and as well as the fact that the queen moved over here first when this pawn was threatening to advance. That was interesting too. So yeah. So anything else you want to add in conclusion?
I don't think so. I mean, I guess the only thing that I kind of wanted to bring out from this is I had definitely been looking at what those recommendations were, the recommended moves, and it was funny because consistent with the analysis that I did, that knight that lands, sorry, the knight that comes out here did recommend again pushing that knight onto h5, and I think yet again it would have been a much better game for black had they done that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's definitely I don't know, if I were to play as black in this position, regardless of which was chosen or how that played out, it is very uncomfortable because it's very very bottlenecked, very closed, and white has a lot of space. So, but white has to convert that space into an advantage and a win in order to actually get something out of it. So,
pleasure learning the London system. I hope anyone that was watching learned something as well.
Yes. Thank you guys so much, and see you next week. Continue to improve your game. Bye.
Sure.